March 6, 1860. Cold air moved along the brick walls of Boston as Christopher Minor Spencer stepped out of the patent office with fresh papers folded inside his coat. Carriage wheels struck the frozen ruts of the street. Iron shoes rang on cobblestones, and whistles from nearby factories marked the change of another workday. The document he carried recorded a new kind of shoulder arm, a lever-actuated repeating rifle that fed metallic cartridges from a magazine in the buttstock, 7 shots ready without a single charge of loose powder poured down a muzzle. Spencer had spent months shaping and hardening the parts described in that patent, turning sketches into steel and wood that could survive more than a few careful demonstrations. In that year, most armed men in the United States trusted weapons that demanded slow routines. Soldiers on drill fields loaded Springfield and Enfield rifle muskets from the front, tearing paper cartridges with their teeth, pouring powder, seating a conical bullet with an iron ramrod, and setting a percussion cap on the nipple before each shot. Civilian officers and watchmen in growing towns relied on percussion revolvers such as the Colt Army model, and on single-barrel or double-barrel shotguns built around simple locks and stout barrels. Farmers, trappers, and stagecoach guards kept older fowling pieces and hunting rifles that had been converted from flintlock to percussion ignition, still filled from the muzzle with hand-measured charges. The pace of any fight was tied directly to those steps. Spencer came from a part of New England where machinery had already shortened many tasks that used to depend on hand labor. In textile mills, automatic winding machines he had designed as a young man turned spindles at a steady rate while workers watched for broken threads and mechanical faults. Later employment at arms works in the Connecticut River Valley exposed him to interchangeable parts, specialized machine tools, and jigs that controlled every cutting operation. In that setting, he studied not only how a finished rifle should look, but how many motions a worker performed between each cut or assembly step. Those habits of observation led naturally to a question about firing as well as making a gun, whether the work of loading and shooting could be concentrated into a repeatable cycle driven by one firm movement of the hand and arm, rather than by many separate actions. The patent granted on March 6th described the result. Instead of a solid stock filled only with wood, Spencer bored a tube through the butt and used it as a magazine for rimfire cartridges, a spring and follower pressing them toward the action. The central part of the mechanism was a rotating breech block that pivoted down to expose the chamber when the shooter lowered the operating lever. At the same time, the lever cocked the hammer and aligned a fresh cartridge with the bore, so that raising the lever closed the block and pushed the round into the chamber. Pulling the trigger fired the shot, and repeating the motion of the lever ejected the spent case and prepared the next round. A practiced user could send 7 aimed shots downrange in the time a muzzle loader delivered only 1 or 2, and then refill the magazine from preloaded tubes carried in a cartridge box. Many senior Army officers, however, measured weapons by past campaigns rather than by workshop drawings. They remembered Mexico and the frontier posts of the 1840s and 1850s, where smoothbore and early rifled muskets had been expected to function in rain, mud, and wind with little attention beyond regular cleaning. Even the percussion ignition system still seemed modern to some of them, and they knew from experience that fouling, rust, or poor caps could silence a line of infantry. When they heard descriptions of a 7-shot rifle with a moving breech block and a magazine hidden inside the stock, they pictured an arm that might fail when dropped, clogged with dirt, or exposed to hard service in the saddle. To minds formed in that environment, more parts meant more potential breakage and more confusion among recruits already struggling with basic drill. Similar doubts extended out along county seats and scattered frontier towns where lawmen carried guns as daily tools. Sheriffs and marshals in those places worked with tight budgets approved by local boards that watched every coin. They knew how to keep a double-barrel shotgun or a single-shot carbine in service with the help of a blacksmith, spare nipples, and simple hand tools. Powder and lead could be bought in bulk and cast or measured as needed. The Spencer design, by contrast, required factory-loaded metallic cartridges of a particular size and construction. To men who lived far from Eastern suppliers, the thought of arming a jail guard or deputy with a rifle that became useless when shipments failed raised serious concern. An older percussion carbine might be slow, but it could still be supplied with locally cast balls and powder as long as any trade reached the town. Another concern revolved around restraint. Officers who trained militia companies believed that a slow loading routine imposed a kind of control on excited men under fire. Each step of biting, pouring, ramming, and capping forced the shooter to pause and think before sending another bullet. They feared that a magazine rifle would remove that pause. A nervous recruit could empty all 7 rounds in a few heartbeats, producing noise without accuracy and leaving himself defenseless with an empty gun. Sheriffs who had watched inexperienced deputies handle revolvers worried about a similar problem in street confrontations, imagining panicked firing that sprayed bullets across a dark alley until both magazine and pocket were empty. From their point of view, an arm that offered more shots also offered more opportunity for poor judgment. Spencer worked against these perceptions with careful testing long before the patent was filed. In a rented workshop, he built prototype rifles, then exposed them to conditions meant to imitate field use rather than a clean indoor range. He fired strings of shots until black powder residue coated the chamber and the bearing surfaces of the action, checking whether the lever still moved without binding. He left one rifle standing unused through damp weather, then operated it repeatedly to see whether swollen wood or light rust on pins and screws interfered with cartridge feeding. When a part showed weakness, he changed its dimensions or the way it was hardened, and he altered cam shape so that the breech block locked and unlocked with firm, direct pressure. The goal was not simply to demonstrate clever engineering, but to reach a level of reliability that would satisfy men who lived with weapons at hand each day. Outside that workshop, political and sectional tensions drew the country toward open conflict. Reports from Kansas described armed clashes between pro-slavery and free state partisans, often fought with a mix of older muskets, hunting rifles, and revolvers that had seen many owners. Newspapers from Missouri and the territories recounted raids and reprisals along isolated roads, where small mounted groups exchanged shots and then disappeared into open country. In these accounts, the pace of combat always returned to the limits imposed by single-shot arms. A sentry who fired at oncoming riders had only a narrow moment to reload while standing exposed. A small posse that held a doorway or cabin window against an armed gang had to plan who would shoot and who would stand ready with a fresh loaded firearm when the first barrels went empty. The patent that left the Boston office on March 6th entered that environment through short notices in official records and legal columns. Most citizens never saw the detailed claims, but men involved in arms making and investment read them carefully. The document did not describe a minor modification to an existing musket. It laid out a complete system combining a metallic cartridge, a tubular magazine, and a lever-operated breech in a single pattern. For industrialists who had seen profits from sewing machines, machine tools, and standardized firearms, such a design pointed toward a product that could be built in significant numbers and sold wherever governments or private buyers wanted modern arms. The language of the patent also defined how far others could go without infringing, an important shield in a competitive field where rival inventors and companies watched each other closely. Still, a legal grant did not guarantee adoption. Spencer needed capital to organize production, and he needed endorsements from officers whose names carried weight in the War Department. He also needed the interest of local authorities who might consider purchasing a few of the rifles for sheriffs, marshals, or prison guards once the design moved from prototype to factory output. These groups looked at more than mechanical drawings. They thought about storage, training, and the broader effect of putting a rapid-fire weapon into official service. A prison warden, for example, might appreciate the advantage a guard with a 7-shot rifle would hold over a group of escaping convicts. Yet he also had to consider what might happen if such a rifle were seized in a struggle or smuggled out through bribery or theft. The same calculation applied to frontier courts and county jails that had already seen revolvers diverted into criminal hands. Daily practice on the edges of settlement showed how such a change could matter. In a river town, a deputy often began his morning by checking the caps on his percussion revolver and making sure a single-shot carbine stood loaded but uncapped behind the office door. Far to the southwest, a Texas Ranger on patrol kept a shotgun across his saddle, a brace of revolvers on his belt, and spare cylinders or loose cartridges in pockets and saddlebags. Stagecoach guards on the overland routes filled double barrels with buckshot and seated caps carefully before each leg of the journey, counting on the weight of lead from each discharge to break an attack. None of these men expected to fire many shots in one encounter. Training, experience, and the limitations of their arms all pushed them to conserve powder and lead for the moments when there was no choice but to pull the trigger. The idea of a compact repeating carbine entering that world created a new balance of advantage that each group tried to imagine in concrete terms. A lawman pictured himself stepping into a narrow street where several armed men waited, knowing that he could fire again and again without pausing to reload after the first shot. The same man then had to picture those opponents with similar rifles in their hands. Every increase in the firepower of one side tended to push the other toward the same tools, and the Spencer design sat at the beginning of that exchange. A jailbreak, a stage holdup, or a clash between a posse and a mounted gang would look very different if one person could place 7 controlled shots into the fight in the time it once took to manage 2. For the moment, though, the Spencer repeating rifle existed mainly as a set of precise mechanisms in a few prototype guns, and as numbered lines of ink in the patent clerk's records. March 6, 1860 marked the point at which that design gained formal recognition, but most officers, legislators, and local officials still treated the repeating concept with caution or open skepticism. Some dismissed it with short remarks about wasted ammunition and delicate parts. Others reserved judgment until they could see the rifle tested by hard use in the field. As Spencer walked away from the patent office that winter afternoon, the order of weapons in the United States remained what it had been for years. Muzzle-loading muskets and simple shotguns in the hands of most soldiers and lawmen, and percussion revolvers riding on the belts of those who kept guard in towns, on trails, and along the frontier. The newly granted patent created the conditions for a change that would become visible only when war and frontier violence forced men to measure the value of rapid fire at close range. August 18, 1863. Heat settled over Washington City, pressing dust and coal smoke into the air around the executive mansion as Christopher Spencer stepped through the gate with his rifle case in hand. Soldiers of the guard watched him cross the gravel with the cautious focus of men who had seen assassins move through crowds, but a written pass and the name already on their list cleared his way. Inside, the halls of wartime government felt crowded and hurried. Clerks carrying bundles of papers, officers in worn field uniforms waiting on benches for orders that might send fresh regiments into Tennessee or Virginia. Spencer moved through that current toward the office of the president, carrying the product of 3 strained years with factories, ordnance boards, and state officials who still did not fully accept what his weapon could do. The war had already tested his design in scattered hands. The Navy Department had ordered a first batch of rifles 2 years earlier, impressed by the solid construction and the waterproof metallic cartridges that held up under salt air and hard service aboard ship. Some northern state governors had used their own funds to equip select regiments with repeaters, hoping to give their volunteers an edge on contested ground. A few mounted units carried Spencer carbines on raids and patrols, where troopers learned that a moving column could deliver a sudden burst of fire and then keep advancing instead of halting to reload. Yet the main body of the Union Army still marched and fought with rifle muskets that followed the pattern laid down before the conflict began. The Ordnance Department had not changed its basic choice. Inside that bureau, resistance took the form of memoranda and committee minutes rather than shouted arguments. Senior officers calculated how many cartridges a regiment might expend in one hard day if each man held a repeating carbine or rifle. They compared that figure to the capacity of existing railroads, wagon trains, and depots already strained by the needs of infantry armed with single-shot weapons. The cost of each Spencer, measured in wartime dollars, stood several times higher than that of a standard Springfield rifle musket. Officers who answered for every line of the supply budget pointed to that difference, to the difficulty of producing specialized ammunition in sufficient quantities, and to the risk that poorly trained soldiers might discharge every round in their magazines before an officer could steady them. In their view, the Army needed consistency and control more than mechanical speed. Spencer responded with evidence instead of statements. When he could not convince the ordnance staff in formal trials, he visited governors, line officers, and naval officials who were more willing to experiment. Reports filtered back from fields in Tennessee and from the Atlantic coast where small bodies of men armed with his weapons had stopped determined attacks or held positions under heavy pressure. Letters described volleys that began as a steady crackling line and did not falter while horsemen tried to close the distance. Prisoners spoke of facing fire that did not pause for ramrods or cartridge boxes, only for the brief change of an empty rifle from one man to another. These accounts circulated in newspapers and private correspondence, yet they did not overturn the cautious arguments written on Ordnance Department stationery. By mid-1863, the summer campaign had left deep casualties on fields from Pennsylvania to Mississippi, and public patience wore thin with every list of dead and wounded posted at telegraph offices. In that atmosphere, Spencer decided that he could no longer work through ordinary channels. A personal appeal to the president seemed the only route left. He prepared one of his best Model 1860 rifles, making sure that every surface moved smoothly, that the magazine spring-fed cartridges without hesitation, and that the sights were adjusted for moderate range. He packed cartridges and a marked wooden target into cases that could be carried into the executive mansion without difficulty. Then he sent a letter requesting an audience, counting on Abraham Lincoln's known interest in machinery and new tools of war to open the door. The meeting on August 18th placed the inventor and his rifle in a small, plainly furnished room, where the president balanced war maps and petitions. Lincoln listened closely as Spencer described the construction of the arm, the 7-shot magazine in the stock, and the way the lever handled extraction and feeding. Instead of responding with quick remarks, the president asked specific questions. How did the rifle hold up under rain and dust? How quickly could an ordinary soldier learn the sequence for operating the lever and hammer safely? What was the practical range at which an infantryman could expect to hit a man-sized target? When Spencer finished each explanation, Lincoln turned the rifle over in his hands, working the lever slowly, then more briskly, feeling how the parts moved. A demonstration followed outside the city streets on open ground where noise and risk could be contained. Lincoln walked with Spencer, the president's son Robert, and a Navy official who carried additional ammunition. They passed the War Department, where the president paused long enough to send for the Secretary of War to join them. The small party continued on to a stretch of grass and bare earth near the unfinished Washington Monument. a space that wartime Washington treated as an informal proving ground for new artillery and small arms. A target board was set up at a distance chosen to match practical battlefield shooting. Spencer loaded the magazine, worked the lever to chamber the first round, and raised the rifle to his shoulder. A series of shots followed, each separated only by the movement of the lever and, when required, the manual cocking of the hammer. After the inventor had shown what his design could do in experienced hands, he unloaded the rifle and passed it to the president. Lincoln was tall and spare, with long arms that easily supported the weight of the gun. Under Spencer's eye, he loaded the magazine, learning how to insert cartridges and replace the tube in the buttstock. He operated the lever more deliberately at first, then with increasing confidence, firing a full magazine at the target. Observers watched not only for accuracy but for signs of hesitation or mechanical failure. The rifle fed each round cleanly. Cases ejected as intended. When the last shot echoed across the open ground, the target revealed a tight group of holes that spoke to the combination of an able marksman and a steady weapon. Lincoln understood that a single demonstration did not answer every concern of the ordnance staff, but the experience changed the weight of the argument in his mind. He had now seen the rifle work under his own hands. He had felt how quickly a man with basic training could cycle the action and send accurate fire downrange. In conversations after the test, he pressed his subordinates to move beyond theoretical objections and to measure the weapon against the reality of a war that consumed soldiers faster than industry could replace them. Reports of infantry standing in long lines under heavy assault, loading and firing single-shot muskets while rushed reinforcements struggled to reach the field, had filled his desk for 2 years. A rifle that let a smaller number of men deliver a higher volume of aimed fire had obvious weight in that context. Inside the Ordnance Department, the president's interest did not erase every objection overnight. Some officials continued to argue that repeating rifles should remain limited to specialized units or to cavalry that already carried lighter carbines. They maintained that infantry needed the dependable simplicity of the standard rifle musket, that officers would find it harder to control rates of fire if every man in the line held a 7-shot arm. Yet the language in their memoranda shifted after August 18th. Discussions began to include questions of training doctrine, ammunition reserves, and stepwise adoption instead of outright refusal. The deliberate resistance that had slowed earlier requests gave way to cautious planning for larger contracts. Lincoln's direct order to test and procure repeaters forced that change. While those debates proceeded, state-purchased Spencer rifles continued to appear on scattered battlefields. In certain brigades, mounted infantrymen learned to dismount, form lines behind improvised cover, and unleash volleys from repeating carbines that stunned attacking forces accustomed to the slower rhythm of muzzle loaders. Commanders who witnessed such action sent their own recommendations back to Washington, describing in plain terms how a few hundred men with repeaters had held key positions, opened gaps in enemy formations, or broken charges that would have overwhelmed equal numbers armed with older weapons. These reports gave the president additional support when he pressed his ordnance officers to expand purchases. The effect of Lincoln's demonstration soon appeared in factory ledgers and shipping records. Orders from federal authorities increased, followed by contracts for shorter carbines suited to cavalry and mounted infantry. The Spencer Repeating Rifle Company and its subcontractors expanded production, hiring more workers and running machines for longer hours. Crates of rifles and carbines moved by rail from eastern workshops to depots closer to the front, then by wagon to camps where quartermasters issued them to designated regiments. Soldiers who received the new arms drilled in the manual of arms adapted for lever-action weapons, learning how to keep the magazine topped off, how to manage ammunition in combat, and how to clear stoppages without damaging the mechanism. This process touched law enforcement only indirectly at first, but the pattern was clear for those who paid attention. Federal arsenals began to accumulate older single-shot rifles and muskets as volunteer units traded them in for repeaters. Surplus sales to civilians and state agencies placed these discarded arms in the hands of sheriffs, railroad guards, and prison authorities who could not yet afford the newest repeaters but watched them closely. At the same time, individual soldiers who purchased their own Spencer carbines or rifles carried them home when their terms of service expired. Some settled in growing western towns where they kept the familiar 7-shot carbines over their doors or behind counters as they shifted from uniformed service to local roles as constables, deputies, or town guards. August 18th, 1863, therefore marked more than a brief afternoon on a field near the unfinished monument. It stood as a turning point in the acceptance of repeating rifles within federal authority. A single practical trial in the presence of the president accelerated decisions that had been delayed by habit and fear of change. In the months that followed, more soldiers entered combat with Spencer rifles and carbines in their hands. Every engagement in which those arms delivered concentrated fire added to a growing body of experience. That experience would follow veterans into the Western territories after the war, shaping their expectations of what a well-armed lawman or outlaw could do with a weapon that fired again and again without the old ritual of ramrod and powder charge. October 5th, 1864. On the height above the Western and Atlantic Railroad cut at Allatoona Pass in northern Georgia, Federal infantry stood inside packed earth walls while first light thinned the mist over the trees. The railroad had been carved through the Allatoona Mountains in a deep trench more than 180 feet from rim to tracks, and on each side of that cut, Union engineers had thrown up forts and rifle pits to guard the line and the supply depot stacked with food behind them. The position existed to protect the rations that kept William Tecumseh Sherman's army moving after the capture of Atlanta, and every officer in the garrison knew that without those supplies the advance into Georgia would slow or halt. Brigadier General John M. Corse had reached the pass only days before with reinforcing troops and had taken overall command of the defense. His numbers were modest, just over 2,000 men in total, drawn from several Midwestern regiments, an artillery battery, and detachments holding blockhouses along the railroad. Many of his infantrymen carried the same single-shot rifle muskets used throughout the Union Army. One regiment, however, brought a different weapon to the earthworks. The 7th Illinois Veteran Infantry, a hardened unit of roughly 300 men, had privately purchased Henry Lever action rifles, 16-shot repeating arms chambered for .44 caliber rimfire cartridges. Each man who carried one had paid a large portion of his own wages for it, convinced that the extra cost bought a clear advantage on the field. The Henry differed from the muzzle-loading rifles stacked in other parts of the works in several important ways. Ammunition came in self-contained brass cases holding bullet, powder, and primer. Cartridges fed into a tubular magazine running under the barrel, pushed toward the breech by a spring. A quick stroke of the lever and the rising lifter carried a round into line with the chamber. Closing the lever seated the cartridge and cocked the hammer. Pulling the trigger fired the shot. A practiced soldier could fire every round in the magazine before a man with a standard rifle musket finished the slow steps of biting a cartridge, pouring powder, ramming a bullet, placing a cap, and shouldering the weapon again. The 7th Illinois had drilled with their Henry rifles until that movement of the lever and hammer became a smooth, reliable sequence. As dawn settled into clear morning, Major General Samuel G. French's Confederate division approached the pass. His men had marched under orders to seize the depot and cut the railroad that carried supplies from Chattanooga toward Sherman's army at Atlanta. French positioned his brigades in the woods and slopes beyond the Federal forts while his artillery unlimbered on higher ground. Around 7 in the morning, Confederate guns opened fire, the crash of shells echoing back and forth between the hills that framed the railroad. Cut. Solid shot and explosive shells struck the earthworks and the grounds inside them, throwing dirt and splinters through the air. Union artillerists replied from their own positions, but the defenders remained largely under cover, conserving small arms fire while the bombardment tore at parapets and buildings. After 2 hours of artillery work, French sent a flag of truce forward with a written demand. He called on the federal commander to surrender the garrison and its stores, warning that refusal would bring an assault and that he would not answer for the lives lost. Corse read the message, understood that he sat in the path of a larger Confederate plan aimed at Sherman's communications, and refused. The crisp reply went back across the shattered ground. Once the messenger had cleared the lines, Union guns sent a shot as a clear signal that the defense would continue. On the heights and in the ravines around the pass, Confederate infantry stepped off toward the forts. The terrain forced them into difficult approaches. The railroad cut itself ran like a chasm through the center of the battlefield, with steep sides that exposed any unit trying to cross under fire. On each rim stood earthworks. On the west side, the so-called Star Fort projected angles and ditches toward the slopes, its earthen parapets topped with heavy timber and brush. On the east side, another redoubt guarded the depot and supported blockhouses along the rails. Corse concentrated most of his force in the western fort, where he expected the strongest attack, and relied on Colonel John Tourtelot's men to hold the eastern works and maintain communication. A narrow footbridge spanned the cut, allowing runners and ammunition carriers to move between the two sides while shells and bullets thudded into the banks below. French sent one brigade under Major General Claudius Sears against the smaller fort on the left of the Confederate line, while another under Brigadier General Francis Cockrell, supported by Brigadier General William Young's Texans, moved against the larger western fort. As the gray and butternut lines advanced up the wooded slopes, they met skirmishers and pickets who fell back toward the main works while firing. Smoke thickened between the trees. Confederate soldiers pressed on, climbing over fallen logs and pushing through brush, carrying rifles and muskets with bayonets fixed. Their officers ordered them to close quickly with the defenses, knowing that the longer they stayed on the open slope, the more casualties they would take. Inside the Star Fort and the rifle pits leading toward it, the men of the 7th Illinois and neighboring units waited behind the parapets. Corse ordered careful fire control. Standard rifle muskets loaded and came ready, but the Henry rifles in the hands of the Illinois veterans offered a different pattern of resistance. When the Confederate line closed within effective range, Corse and his officers gave the word. The muzzles of rifles and carbines rose above the earthworks. The first volleys rolled along the fort. Soldiers with single-shot weapons fired and began the familiar reload routine. Along the section held by the 7th Illinois, however, the sound did not fall away between shots. The levers of the Henry rifles moved in a steady rhythm, and the 16-shot magazines sent round after round into the attackers without pause for ramming or reloading from cartridge boxes. Men charging uphill under that fire faced more than the usual sequence of scattered shots. Each time a Confederate soldier raised his head or tried to sprint from one patch of cover to another, he presented a target for several well-drilled riflemen armed with weapons that did not need a new charge after every trigger pull. The repeated impact of bullets began to break ranks. Files faltered as men went down or dragged wounded comrades to rough shelter behind tree trunks and low rocks. Officers trying to dress the line for renewed advances found that the ground in front of the Henry Armed Company became a zone where movement attracted rapid, concentrated fire. Accounts written later by federal engineers and officers made special note of the effect, describing how a single company of 16 shooters covering a segment of parapet produced more sustained musketry than much larger bodies armed with traditional rifles. The attack did not collapse at once. Confederate regiments closed to within yards of the outer works in several places. On parts of the line where defenders used rifle muskets, the assault reached the ditches and low walls, and hand-to-hand fighting broke out. Men thrust bayonets and clubbed with musket butts. At traverses within the Star Fort, soldiers fired pistols across narrow angles. Corse himself moved among the positions despite incoming fire, issuing orders and encouraging units that had taken heavy losses. A bullet struck his face, shattering part of a cheekbone and tearing away an ear. But he stayed on his feet and continued to direct the defense. Blood from his wound mixed with the dust that coated his uniform, yet he refused evacuation while the outcome remained in doubt. Along the segment manned by the 7th Illinois, the Henry rifles kept working. Each soldier used the lever and hammer by instinct. When magazines neared empty, men dropped to a knee behind the parapet, twisted the loading sleeve at the front of the magazine tube and poured cartridges in from their belt pouches or cartridge boxes, then snapped the sleeve back into place and rose to continue firing. Runners from the eastern works risked the exposed bridge over the cut to bring fresh boxes of ammunition. At times, they crossed with their arms full of cartridges while enemy fire snapped overhead and artillery shells burst against the sides of the cut below, showing how closely the survival of the garrison had become tied to the flow of those rimfire rounds. Confederate officers saw that certain portions of the Federal line could not easily be carried. Reports from their own men mentioned what they called new guns, rifles that fired many times without any visible pause, held by Illinois soldiers behind the center of the Western Works. Attacks shifted toward flanks and toward portions of the fortification that did not seem to blaze with quite the same volume of fire, yet each movement brought the attacking brigades into another sector covered by Henry-armed men or by determined defenders with slower rifles who had more time to reload because the repeaters were keeping the attackers pinned. Over the course of hours, the ground in front of the Star Fort filled with bodies, both dead and wounded, lying in small groups where lines had tried to dress an advance under the continuous fire. During a lull between assaults, signal officers on the ridge received a message from Sherman's headquarters near Kennesaw Mountain. Using flags, Union signalers spelled out an order that urged the garrison to hold, informing them that the Army commander was in the area and watching their fight. Later accounts turned that signal into the phrase, "Hold the fort, I am coming," and a post-war hymn used those words to describe the moment. In fact, no substantial relief reached Allatoona during the battle itself. Corse and his men understood that they would stand or fall with the troops they had on the ground. The signal did, however, confirm that their effort mattered to the larger campaign and stiffened resolve inside the battered forts. French's division renewed its efforts with another hard push. One Confederate brigade struck at the east side of the position where Tourtelot's men fought from their own works and blockhouses to keep the path to the supply depot open. Another wave moved again against the Star Fort. Artillery roared at close range. The slopes around the railroad cut disappeared under powder smoke. Still, the volume of fire from the defenders did not decline. The Henry rifles, supported by muskets and artillery, broke each effort before attackers could gain firm footing on the walls. Confederate units that managed to plant their flags on portions of the outer works found that they could not hold them under the concentrated fire from parapets that had not yet been taken. By mid-afternoon, French received word from his cavalry scouts that Union columns were moving in the wider area. Although those forces would not reach Allatoona in time to fight that day, the reports convinced him that staying in front of the pass any longer risked entrapment between the garrison and a larger body coming up from the south. His division had already paid heavily for the attempt to storm the forts. Casualty lists drawn up later showed that out of a force of roughly 3,300 men, nearly 900 had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Corse's garrison, just over 2,000 at the start, suffered more than 700 casualties, including around 200 taken prisoner in isolated positions overrun during the fighting. Blood streaked the inner faces of the parapets and pooled on the floors of the forts where surgeons worked on wounded men. When French finally broke off the attack and withdrew his brigades from the slopes, the defenders remained in their torn earthworks, too exhausted and depleted to pursue in any organized way. Corse sent a message to Sherman reporting the fight and his condition. He noted that he had lost a cheekbone and an ear, yet was still able to stand against further attacks if necessary. Officers who walked the line after the smoke cleared recorded the specific role of the Henry Rifles in holding the western fort. One Federal engineer observed that a company armed with 16-shot repeaters had risen to the parapet when the assault came closest, their rapid and accurate fire making it impossible for the attackers to maintain a foothold. Statements from those present repeated the conclusion in different words, that the presence of those repeaters among the garrison had made a decisive difference during the critical moments of the battle. The engagement at Allatoona Pass remained small in numbers when compared to the massive clashes at places such as Gettysburg or Spotsylvania, but its results resonated far beyond the hills north of Atlanta. The railroad remained intact. The depot with its stored rations stayed in Union hands. Sherman's campaign continued. More quietly, the battle demonstrated to soldiers, officers, and observers that a limited number of well-trained men armed with reliable repeating rifles could hold strong positions against larger forces armed with traditional single-shot weapons. Veterans who had seen the Henry in action carried that memory with them into post-war life. Some would later ride west with repeaters in their scabbards, expecting a level of individual firepower that changed how both lawmen and outlaws measured the odds in any future fight. September 17, 1868. Night thinned on the Arickaree Fork of the Republican River, leaving a low gray light over the sandbars and quiet water where Major George A. Forsyth's scouts lay in shallow pits scooped from gravel. The air held the cold of the high plains at the edge of autumn. Horses that had survived the first day's fire stood hobbled close to the central island, their flanks streaked with dust and sweat. Other mounts lay dead in a rough circle around the defenders, bodies dragged into position and piled as improvised breastworks. Beyond that ring of carcasses and scooped earth, the prairie rose in gentle swells toward higher ground, stripped nearly bare by wind and grazing herds. Somewhere in that half-light, hundreds of mounted Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors prepared to renew the attack. Forsyth had led his scouts onto that island 3 days earlier. The column had left Fort Wallace in western Kansas with around 50 frontiersmen, many of them seasoned plainsmen, buffalo hunters, and former soldiers recruited as civilian volunteers for a special service. They moved with pack animals and led horses, following reports of recent raids along the Kansas Pacific Railroad and on isolated ranches. Orders from higher command directed Forsyth to find the raiding parties and punish them strongly enough to discourage further attacks. His men wore a mix of army clothing and civilian gear. In their scabbards and hands, they carried Spencer carbines, compact repeating arms that had already seen use in the Civil War and on earlier expeditions. The scouts knew the weight and feel of those carbines and had confidence in what they could do when a small group needed to stand against a larger force. On September 17th, just before dawn, distant sounds of movement had carried across the prairie to the sandbar where the scouts had made camp. The day before, scattered skirmishing had shown that hostile warriors knew exactly where the column was. Now the full reaction formed. In the growing light, mounted figures appeared on the ridges beyond the river, some holding shields and lances, others with rifles or bows across their arms. The war party gathering around the island included many Cheyenne Dog soldiers and other experienced fighters hardened by years of conflict with soldiers, hunters, and settlers. They had studied the habits of army columns and knew that small detachments were vulnerable in open country. The sandbar where Forsyth's men had stopped for water looked like the place where a scouting force could be trapped and destroyed. The first major attack came with speed and force that tested every part of the scouts' preparations. Warriors rode in large circles around the island, then angled inward at a gallop, firing from the saddle. Bullets, arrows, and iron-headed lances struck the mounted horses, kicked up sand, and swept through the shallow pits where scouts pressed themselves low against the earth. Forsyth and his second-in-command, Lieutenant Frederick Beecher, shouted orders above the roar. Men with Spencer carbines responded with controlled volleys aimed at riders as they closed. The carbines were already loaded. Each man had checked his weapon as the enemy formed up, making sure that the magazines held a full set of cartridges. Now the scouts brought the guns to their shoulders and fired as fast as they could acquire targets. The effect of that concentrated fire halted the first rush. Horses went down in mid-stride, pitching their riders to the ground. Warriors leaned low along their mounts' sides in an effort to use the animals as moving shields, a technique that had served them well against troops armed with slower rifles and carbines. Against scouts with repeaters, the margin of safety shrank. Each time a rider showed even part of his body while changing position, one or more of the defenders sent bullets into the exposed area. Men on the island had no time to count shots. They worked the levers, kept their magazines supplied from cartridge belts, and aimed at any enemy who tried to cross the narrow, shallow channels that separated the central bar from the surrounding sand. During that first morning's fighting, Forsyth was wounded. Bullets shattered one of his legs and then smashed through the ankle of the other. Beecher took a shot that cut deep into his body. Several other scouts fell dead or badly hurt in the pits, their carbines picked up and passed to comrades still able to fire. Blood seeped into the sand. The wounded who could move pulled themselves into lower spots behind the impediments built from horse carcasses. Those who could not move lay where they had been hit, their only protection the return fire from friends. Despite these losses, the scouts' line did not break. The Spencer carbines in the hands of the men still on their feet delivered a near-continuous stream of shots whenever an attack pressed close enough to threaten the perimeter. As the sun climbed, the war party altered its tactics. Large mass charges gave way to smaller groups of warriors working forward by bounds, looking for blind spots in the defenders' field of fire. Some dug shallow scrapes in the sand within carbine range, using them as firing points. Others took advantage of low folds in the ground and dry stream beds to creep closer. Shots cracked out from those positions, seeking any unprotected head or shoulder that rose above the island's makeshift barricade. The scouts answered with careful aimed fire intended to suppress or dislodge these skirmishers. In that work, the magazine capacity of the Spencers allowed pairs of men to maintain overlapping patterns of fire. One could reload or adjust position while the other continued shooting, a rhythm that kept pressure on enemy riflemen who needed to raise up from their own cover to aim. By midday, the island stank of blood, sweat, and the ruptured bodies of horses. The sun beat down without shade. Scouts tore strips from shirts and saddle blankets to bind wounds and to plug holes torn in sandbanks by artillery-sized bullets. Water in the shallow pools around the island fell quickly. When men reached to fill canteens under fire, enemy marksmen picked at them. Forsyth, unable to stand, lay in a dugout wrapped in blankets. From there he still directed the defense, passing orders through messengers who crawled from one pit to another. Rifles lay in stacks near his position, ready to be redistributed to any man whose carbine was damaged. The small command now measured its prospects in cartridges and in the ability of the Spencers to keep turning enemy advances into piles of bodies outside the perimeter. At one point during the fighting, a large mounted attack tried to crash through on the north side of the island. Among the leaders was the Cheyenne war chief Roman Nose, known for his skill and courage in riding close to enemy lines. He and other mounted men charged toward a narrow channel that separated the main island from a smaller bar. Their horses churned up sprays of water and sand as they splashed through. Scouts responded by concentrating their fire on the leading riders. A bullet struck Roman's nose, knocking him from the saddle. His fall and the volume of fire that hit the front of the charge broke the momentum. Warriors pulled back, carrying wounded comrades with them when they could and leaving others on the ground. Through the afternoon and into the second day, the fight settled into a brutal siege. The war party surrounded the island at a distance, keeping scouts confined with harassing fire. Any attempt to leave the shallow defenses for more than a few yards risked death. The scouts still had their carbines and ammunition, but food and water ran short. Several men volunteered to slip out under cover of darkness to reach the nearest army posts for help. One after another, runners crawled through the shallows or tried to use night and sparse brush as concealment. Some did not return. At least one reached friendly lines days later, staggering into a post with dried blood on his clothing to report that the scouts remained on their island, low on supplies yet still holding their position with repeating carbines. The defenders understood exactly how much their survival depended on the function of those weapons. During lulls in the shooting, men stripped their spencers, wiped dust and fouling from working parts with rags already stained dark, and checked springs and firing pins by touch. Others used canteens sparingly to moisten cloth for cleaning without wasting the last drinkable water. The carbines had to fire when the next rush took shape on the ridges. Any failure in that moment would open a gap in the tight ring of fire that kept mounted warriors from overrunning the shallow pits and improvised barricades. The scouts had seen what happened when even one rider broke into their perimeter, and they knew that another close assault would come before the warriors abandoned the effort as too costly. On the surrounding prairie, the war party watched the island and weighed choices. The initial expectation had been that a small force caught in such an exposed position could be overwhelmed by speed and numbers. Past fights against infantry and cavalry units armed mainly with single-shot carbines and rifles had reinforced that belief. On the Aricari Fork, however, the defenders' ability to send many shots from each firing point without long pauses had changed the calculation. Warriors had lost relatives and friends in the first day's charges. Chiefs and experienced fighters counted the dead and thought about the value of taking an isolated group of scouts compared to the cost in men needed for further raids and defense of their own villages. Gradually, the intensity of direct attacks began to ebb. Harassing fire continued, but the large mounted swarms that had circled the island at dawn no longer formed. Rescue for the scouts finally came after more than a week on the sandbar. Relief columns under Colonel Lewis Carpenter and other officers followed the trail of spent cartridges, dead animals, and discarded camp gear left by the original march and by the fighting around the island. When they approached the Aricari Fork, they found the war party gone and the defenders reduced almost to a skeleton force. Several men had died of wounds and exposure after the shooting lessened. Others survived only through the care of comrades who shared their last rations and water. Forsyth still lived, though his shattered legs would never fully heal. Beecher and several other officers and scouts lay buried in shallow graves nearby. Carbines that had fired hundreds of rounds over the course of the siege rested in the pits, their stocks cut and scarred by bullets and hard use. News of the fight on the Aricari Fork spread quickly through army circles after survivors reached posts on the plains. Reports emphasized that no regular infantry regiment had been present, only a small detachment of civilian scouts under an officer with limited resources. Descriptions of the battle made it clear that the scouts' Spencer carbines had been central to their defense. Officers who read the accounts noted that the island's shallow trenches and dead horse barricades would not have been enough without weapons that allowed each man to fire rapidly at mounted enemies forced to cross narrow channels. The battle became a case study in how repeating rifles could allow a small command to hold a fixed position in open country against a larger force. Those lessons reached beyond formal military doctrine. Men who rode as scouts on the plains often moved later into civilian work as town marshals, county sheriffs, or deputy United States marshals in territories where railroads and cattle trails pushed settlement forward. They remembered the siege and the way a handful of riflemen had survived because each of them could deliver many shots before needing to think about resupply. When these veterans stood in front of general stores or walked into county meetings to argue for better arms, they spoke from experience. The Spencer carbine had proved on the Aracari Fork that a small group with repeaters could stand against numbers that would have crushed a force armed only with single-shot weapons. That knowledge would follow them into their later work, shaping how they armed themselves and how they understood the balance of power between lawmen and their enemies on the open frontier. January 1st, 1873. Snow lay in uneven strips along the brick streets of New Haven, melting into dirty runnels where wagon wheels and boots had churned it down. Inside the long brick buildings of Winchester repeating arms, steam lines hissed and belts flapped on overhead pulleys as machinery started another year of cutting steel and shaping walnut. In one section of the works, foremen moved among benches and fixtures set up for a new pattern of lever-action rifle. The drawings on their clipboards carried a fresh designation in neat ink, Model 1873, steel frame, center fire, new cartridge. Workers at those benches had already spent weeks learning the sequence of operations needed to turn rough forgings into receivers and bolts for a rifle that company officers meant to push far beyond older rimfire and percussion arms. The new model sat at the junction of several developments. During the previous decade, metallic cartridges had moved from experimental novelty to standard practice in many kinds of firearms. Rimfire rounds such as the old .44 Henry cartridge had proved that a sealed, self-contained cartridge resisted moisture and rough handling better than loose powder and ball. At the same time, engineers working with ammunition companies had designed robust center fire cases with separate primers seated in the base. Those cases could be reloaded, necks resized, and charged again by careful users on the frontier or by commercial firms in eastern cities. Winchester's management saw that a repeating rifle built around a strong steel frame and a new center fire cartridge could give customers more power and flexibility than earlier designs that still used weaker rimfire rounds. The cartridge chosen as the heart of the new system was marked in catalogs as .44 Winchester Center Fire. Inside its brass case, a flat-point lead bullet weighing about 200 grains sat over more than 40 grains of black powder. Fired from a standard 24-inch barrel, it produced a muzzle velocity that placed it above the old Henry round in energy without reaching the heavy recoil of full-sized military cartridges. Tests in company yards and in private hunting camps showed that it could drive through deer, antelope, and feral hogs at the distances common in brush and broken prairie. The brass case expanded to seal the chamber against gas escape, then contracted after firing so that the action could extract it cleanly. For ranchers, hunters, and lawmen who might need to reload cartridges in camp to stretch limited supplies, the ability to reuse cases in simple tools had obvious value. Winchester paired that cartridge with an improved version of the familiar toggle-link lever action. Instead of the bronze alloy frames used on earlier models, the 1873 used iron and later steel receivers, stronger and more resistant to wear at critical bearing points. Side plates on each side of the action could be removed to expose the mechanism for cleaning or repairs. An advantage in remote areas where a broken spring or worn part had to be replaced with whatever a local smith or mail-order supplier could provide. A dust cover sliding over the top of the receiver protected the ejection port from grit when the rifle rode in a scabbard or across the saddle. The tubular magazine under the barrel held a dozen rounds in the standard rifle length, and shorter carbines carried fewer cartridges but handled quickly from horseback. By the middle of that year, the first batches of Model 1873 rifles left the New Haven factory in crates bound for distributors and hardware houses. Serial numbers in the low hundreds and thousands appeared in shipping ledgers. At first the numbers were small, scarcely more than a handful of rifles going out in the inaugural year. Company officers expected that pattern. New models always needed time to establish a reputation. Winchester prepared an elaborate catalog that explained the features of the rifle and highlighted the new center fire cartridge. Advertisements emphasized that the arm offered the convenience of a repeating lever gun with a stronger frame and more potent ammunition than its predecessors. Sales agents carried sample rifles to show in city offices and railroad towns, working to place orders with jobbers who supplied country stores far from eastern factories. On counters in general stores across the growing West, the Model 1873 soon lay alongside older double-barrel shotguns, surplus percussion revolvers, and long single-shot rifles. Proprietors listened to traveling salesmen explain the advantages of the new rifle. It took cartridges that remained usable after rain or river crossings. It could be ordered in multiple barrel lengths and with plain or fancy finishes. Most important for many buyers, it fired a commonly stocked cartridge that ammunition firms were eager to produce. Boxes marked in bold type with the .44 center fire designation began to appear on shelves, sometimes stacked beside pistol cartridges using the same basic case and bullet. The message was clear. A man could carry one kind of ammunition and feed both his long gun and his sidearms, once revolver makers began to chamber their products for the same round. On cattle ranges stretching through Kansas, Nebraska, and Texas, the rifle started to prove itself as a daily tool. A drover riding night guard over a restless herd found that a lever action with a full magazine gave him confidence when coyotes or wolves circled close in the dark. He could work the lever and touch off a string of shots toward shapes moving just beyond the firelight, using the flash of each shot to correct his aim instead of stopping after each discharge to dig for loose cartridges. Ranch owners noticed that a single hired hand with such a rifle could turn back predators or chase off horse thieves without needing a partner to supply alternate fire. When disputes flared over water rights or line camps, men faced each other knowing that one person with a loaded Model 1873 could send many bullets down a fence line or across a dry arroyo before anyone on the other side had a chance to close. Town marshals and county sheriffs examined the new rifles as they passed through freight depots. Many had carried earlier repeaters during the war or on scouting details. They understood the value of fast, controlled fire in cramped streets or when stepping into a darkened saloon. For them, the Model 1873 offered several advantages over the aging carbines that still leaned in office corners. The steel frame stood up to constant carrying and rough handling. The new cartridge gave better penetration on horseflesh or wagon wood when they needed to stop a fleeing rider or break the axle of a getaway rig. Some sheriffs arranged with county commissioners to buy one or two rifles for official use, arguing that a dependable repeating arm in the hands of a lawman might prevent the need for larger posses and reduce the number of bystanders caught in crossfire. Cost still mattered. When introduced, a standard Model 1873 rifle carried a price tag around $50. A significant sum at a time when laborers might earn $1 or less a day and an acre of land on the plains could cost less than $20. Some buyers dealt with that expense by pooling money. Two brothers sharing a homestead bought a single rifle with the understanding that whoever rode farthest from the house took it along. A small town hired a marshal and provided him with a county-owned Model 1873 in place of higher wages. In mining camps where pay came in irregular bursts, a gambler or saloon keeper might buy a rifle and then rent it out to guards during periods of tension. As production increased and costs came down in later years, the rifle moved from rare household treasure to more common presence on ranches and in cabins. But in the early period, each purchase represented a serious decision. The new Winchester did not erase older arms at once. Many settlers still relied on simple shotguns for hunting and defense, loading them with shot or ball according to need. Single-shot rifles in larger calibers remained popular for long-range hunting of elk or buffalo on open grasslands. Yet the lever-action center-fire combination filled a particular niche. It excelled at middle distances within 200 yards where threats sprang up suddenly and had to be answered while both shooter and target were moving. Wolf hunters found that a repeating rifle let them engage several animals in a running pack before they scattered. Stagecoach guards hired to ride shotgun on lines that served new railheads appreciated that a Model 1873 could send a string of shots at mounted bandits weaving along the coach without the long pause required to reload a shotgun after 2 discharges. Within a few years, ammunition makers beyond Winchester itself added .44 center fire loads to their catalogs. Union Metallic Cartridge, other Eastern firms and regional suppliers produced cartridges that could be bought in larger towns from Montana to New Mexico. Wooden ammunition boxes marked with stencils traveled west by rail and freight wagon. In remote settlements, a single storekeeper might stock dozens of different items marked in that caliber, from rifle loads to pistol cartridges. For lawmen assigned to wide territories, that distribution pattern reduced the risk of being caught short when far from their home office. A deputy riding through a string of small towns could expect to find replacement ammunition for his rifle in most general stores. This reliability of supply encouraged more officers and armed citizens to commit to the cartridge and the rifles that used it. Not every reaction to the Model 1873 was enthusiastic. Some older officers warned that reliance on a repeating rifle could lead to careless fire. They had seen nervous men with lever guns yank the trigger as fast as they could work the action, sending bullets down range without proper aim. They argued that a long gun with such potential required strict discipline, clear rules of engagement and training that emphasized deliberate shooting even under pressure. Town councils in some districts insisted that repeating rifles carried by law officers should be kept in racks in the office except in emergencies, fearing that constant display of powerful arms on the street would increase tension with local citizens. Debates over policy played out in courthouse meetings and newspaper columns, reflecting a broader anxiety about how much individual firepower should be entrusted to any one person. At the same time, outlaws watched the spread of the new Winchester and drew their own conclusions. Train robbers and gang leaders who read city newspapers or listened to tales from discharged cowhands understood that they could not approach a well-armed guard or sheriff with only a cap and ball revolver and expect to dominate the encounter. Some began to seek out Model 1873 rifles for themselves, buying them under assumed names or stealing them in raids on ranch houses and small arms dealers. When a gang equipped itself with such rifles, it gained the ability to pour sustained fire at a posse from behind rocks or cabin walls, matching or exceeding anything that most county offices could field on short notice. The arms race that had begun in New Haven assembly rooms continued across the plains and into mountain passes. Production figures for the Model 1873 rose rapidly after the first hesitant year. Company records show that only a small number of rifles left the factory in 1873, then a modest increase the next year, followed by thousands more as sales agents secured orders and users reported good results. Over the next decades, total manufacture climbed into the hundreds of thousands. Each rifle carried a unique serial number stamped into its frame, a mark that tied it to a line in factory ledgers with information about barrel length, caliber, and destination. Many of those entries listed Western shipping points, from Missouri river towns that served as railheads for cattle drives to coastal ports handling freight for territories farther west. Each crate unloaded at a depot added a few more repeating rifles to the Western mix of arms. In cabins, bunkhouses, and town offices, owners learned the particular habits of their Model 1873s. They discovered that the action stayed smoother if cleaned regularly after firing the black powder ammunition of the time. They learned how far they could trust the sights at different ranges, and how deeply the .44 bullet would penetrate pine logs, adobe walls, or a steer's shoulder. They experimented with cartridge belts, sling arrangements, and scabbards on saddle rigs. Over time, a pattern emerged. In many households and workplaces, the Winchester lever action became the firearm that hung in easiest reach near the door, while cumbersome long-range rifles or delicate target guns stayed in closets until needed for specific uses. For men who kept order in the growing towns, that prominence had a direct effect on how they responded to threats. By the end of the 1870s, the outline of a new balance of power on the frontier had taken shape. Small groups of lawmen, ranch guards, and railroad detectives armed with Model 1873s could meet hostile riders and stand on more equal terms than earlier officers armed only with pistols and single-shot carbines. At the same time, the availability of the same rifles to anyone with enough cash or audacity meant that gangs and violent individuals could arm themselves to a level that challenged lightly equipped local authorities. The Model 1873 had become woven into the daily life of the plains and mining camps, serving hunters and herders as much as officers of the law or men outside it. Its steady lever stroke and deep magazine of center-fire cartridges turned individual skill and judgment into force that could reach far down a street, along a fence line, or across a dry wash, setting the conditions for the more famous confrontations that would follow in cattle towns and outlaw strongholds. December 24, 1875. Cold air pushed against the windows of the frame building that held the Dodge City Council meeting, letting in thin drafts that stirred lamp smoke above the heads of the men inside. Outside, the Arkansas River lay under a crust of ice in places, with open water showing in the current where it cut past low banks. On the table in front of the mayor lay a sheet of paper carrying the wording of a proposed ordinance. It stated in blunt terms that no person in Dodge City should carry a pistol, Bowie knife, slungshot, or other deadly weapon concealed within the town limits except officers of the United States, state, county, or city. Fines would follow for those who ignored it. It also tied into a broader rule the council had already agreed in principle to enforce. Guns were not to be worn north of the railroad tracks, the line that local people already called the deadline. The discussion did not come out of nowhere. For several seasons, Dodge City had served as an endpoint for herds brought up from Texas along the Western Trail. When cattle came in, the long street facing the tracks filled with trail dust and the smell of manure. Saloons, gambling rooms, and brothels stayed open late. Buffalo hunters, soldiers from Fort Dodge, railroad workers, and cowboys crowded together in places where drinking, gambling, and old grudges met. Men armed with Colt revolvers and various rifles drifted from one establishment to another. Disputes over cards or women often moved from spoken insults to drawn pistols in a few breaths. Bodies had gone into Boot Hill Cemetery with boots still on their feet, often enough that the town had gained a reputation in regional newspapers as a place where gunfights were part of the local climate. Merchants who had invested in permanent buildings, freight depots, and respectable boarding houses saw a threat in that reputation. They wanted drovers and hunters to spend money in Dodge City, but they also wanted families, bankers, and shopkeepers to settle and build a stable tax base. An image of constant shooting frightened the people they hoped to attract. When the council gathered on that winter evening, many of those merchants sat or stood along the walls. They nodded as the mayor spoke about the need to curb weapons within town. The ordinance before them would not take guns away from ranches or line camps. It would not forbid anyone from owning firearms. It would simply draw a firm rule for the built-up area north of the tracks, where permanent residents had put their houses and businesses. When the council voted, the ordinance passed. The date at the bottom recorded approval on December 24th, 1875. That document put the law on the books. From that moment forward, anyone carrying a concealed pistol or knife in town without official authority faced a fine. At the same time, the practical enforcement of a broader custom began to take sharper form. Men riding in from the south with pistols on their hips and rifles on their saddles were expected to give up those weapons before crossing the tracks into the heart of Dodge City. Some would leave long guns in camp and check revolvers with a stable or saloon. Others would turn everything over at a guard point on the bridge over the Arkansas. As the cattle season of 1876 approached, the signboards went up. At each main entry to the north side, painted boards warned that the carrying of firearms was prohibited within city limits. Near the bridge over the river, one large sign stood in plain view of anyone coming in on the trail. It instructed visitors to deposit their guns before passing further. Smaller notices at doorways repeated the message. Storekeepers hammered up placards stating that customers were expected to turn over revolvers at the counter. Some saloon owners built racks behind the bar where checked weapons could be tagged and stored. The tags themselves were simple pieces of tin or paper marked with numbers or initials, hung on cord or leather thong, given to the owner as proof of claim. Law officers had to turn written rules into reality. At first, that job fell to early marshals and policemen hired under the new municipal government. As the town grew and cattle traffic increased, better-known names took on the work. By 1877, Charles Bassett served as sheriff of Ford County. That year, Bat Masterson joined him as undersheriff, while other familiar figures worked as deputies or city police. By the end of that year, Masterson had been elected sheriff, and his brother Ed had become city marshal. Wyatt Earp served as an assistant marshal for periods, walking Front Street with a badge pinned to his vest. These men all understood that a printed ordinance meant little unless armed citizens believed it would be enforced. Inside the cramped offices near Front Street, lawmen kept their own small arsenal. Revolvers rode on their belts, but heavier weapons rested in racks along the walls. Double-barrel shotguns with cut-down barrels for street use stood beside lever-action rifles with walnut stocks. Several of those long guns were Winchester repeaters capable of firing many centerfire cartridges from tubular magazines without the slow reloading of older weapons. Cartridges for those rifles sat in boxes on shelves and in loops on leather belts. Deputies learned to pull a rifle from the rack, work the lever a few times to feel the action, and check that the magazine and chamber were clear before standing it back in place, ready for a call that might come at any hour. When spring of 1876 brought the first big herds of the new season, the system of control around the deadline moved from council talk to daily practice. A string of riders would appear south of the river, dust rising around the longhorns as the herd bunched near water, while trail bosses arranged grazing and penned some animals near holding yards. Loose riders came ahead into town. They wore pistols at their waist and sometimes carried Winchester or Sharps rifles across their saddles. Many had been on the trail for months. They wanted to drink, gamble, visit dance halls, and forget the hard miles behind them. At the bridge, they met rules that cut against those impulses. A deputy or town policeman stood near the approach, often with a Winchester or shotgun visible in his hands or propped close by. He pointed to the sign and told the drovers they would need to leave their guns before crossing. The first reaction was usually argument. Cowboys claimed they needed their pistols because other trail hands might pick quarrels. They pointed to stories of Indians on the plains and road agents around isolated camps. The officer answered that none of those dangers lay inside the line of buildings north of the tracks, and that the law of Dodge City did not allow strangers to come armed into its streets. Sometimes words were enough. Tired riders slipped revolvers from their holsters, spun them once, and laid them on a nearby table. A clerk wrote names in a ledger and placed the weapons behind a locked door until the owners were ready to leave town. In other cases, officers had to lean on the weight of their own firepower. When a group of especially defiant trail hands tried to ride through without stopping, deputies stepped forward with loaded Winchesters cradled in their arms. Lever actions allowed them to hold the rifles at waist level, magazines already filled, with actions closed on live rounds. A simple movement of the hammer brought them to full readiness. Word spread that no matter how many pistols a trail crew carried, they would be talking into the muzzles of repeating rifles and shotguns if they tried to ignore the ordnance north of the tracks. The presence of those long guns changed how a few officers could stand against larger groups. A single deputy alone with a 6-shot revolver might hesitate to confront a half-dozen armed cowboys in a narrow street. The same deputy, backed by 1 or 2 more with Winchester rifles holding over a dozen cartridges each, could give a direct order and expect it to stick. The men from Texas and the Indian Territory were used to hard fights, but they understood numbers. They knew what a lever-action rifle could do. Many of them owned such rifles themselves on ranches or along the trail. Facing the same kind of weapon in trained hands at short range inside town, most decided that checking their pistols for a few days was better than taking chances on a street corner. Even with those controls, Dodge City did not become quiet. Drinking rooms and gambling houses still saw arguments and blows. Knives came out on occasion. Some visitors managed to slip small pistols past the checking system or bought cheap firearms inside town, yet the scale of violence shifted. Brawls were more likely to end with bruises and cuts than with several men shot dead. Historians later counted the homicides in cattle towns and found that even in the worst year for Dodge City, the number of men killed in gunfights stayed remarkably low compared to later myths. Those figures rested in part on the daily grind of enforcement at the deadline, and on the willingness of lawmen to confront armed troublemakers early using the threat of organized, concentrated fire from long guns. One of the clearest tests of that system came in early April of 1878. Cattle had already started to move again, and the saloons south of the tracks were busy. On the night of April 9th, City Marshal Ed Masterson tried to disarm 2 drunken cattlemen who had been firing pistols in the street. Witnesses later said he took each man by the arm and began to lead them away while removing their weapons. One of them, Jack Wagner, suddenly turned and shot Masterson at close range. The marshal staggered, still able to pull his own revolver and fire. Shots from across the street joined in as Sheriff Bat Masterson and others responded. Wagner went down, wounded fatally. The other man with him, Alf Walker, was also hit. Ed Masterson managed to walk a short distance before collapsing. He died soon after. That killing shook Dodge City. It showed how thin the line of law could be when officers had to put hands on armed men in the close quarters of Front Street. It also hardened the resolve of those who remained. Bat Masterson, now sheriff, enforced the ordinance with even more determination. Deputies carried shotguns openly when quieting crowds. Winchester rifles came off the wall whenever word spread that a group of Texans had decided to take the town, or that a known gunman had arrived on the evening train. The lawmen did not fire these weapons often because the sight of them often settled arguments before the first trigger pull. When they did fire, the effect was decisive. One rifle in experienced hands could cover an entire alley or the length of a saloon bar. Accounts from the time describe more than one instance in which a small knot of deputies armed with long guns confronted a larger group of armed men and ended the incident with few shots. In one such confrontation during the cattle season of 1879, a quarrel in a dance hall spilled into the street. Several riders hurried to their horses, grabbed Winchesters from scabbards, and started back toward the saloon, intending to settle the matter with rifle fire. Before they reached the door, Sheriff Masterson and two deputies stepped out of the shadows near the jail with their own rifles leveled. The sheriff ordered the drovers to halt and drop their guns. The men from the trail faced three muzzles pointed at chest height, each backed by a magazine filled with cartridges. After a tense pause, the cowboys lowered their rifles and obeyed. The incident went into the local paper as another example of firm enforcement rather than as a bloody fight. The pattern repeated, across the short law enforcement careers of famous names in Dodge City. Wyatt Earp spent many nights walking between saloons and dance halls watching for trouble. He carried a pistol most of the time, but he also had access to the long guns in the office. When he expected trouble serious enough to bring a gang of armed men into the street, he and other officers took Winchesters or shotguns with them. Trail bosses knew this. Some of them cooperated with local law by helping disarm their own riders before heading into town. Others waited until after one of their men had spent a night in the city jail, to send a message down the line that ignoring the ordinance would cost wages and maybe blood. Meanwhile, the guns themselves settled into daily life. In daylight, a Winchester leaning in a corner of the marshal's office became part of the background for anyone paying a fine or signing a complaint. The weapon might have a smooth, worn spot on the forearm where hands gripped it in many late-night confrontations. The blued finish on the receiver might be dulled by constant handling. Inside a general store, the same model of rifle might stand in a rack for sale, its steel and wood still fresh. Cowboys and railroad men examined those rifles, worked the levers a few times, and weighed the price against their wages. Some saved pay for months to buy one. Others watched lawmen use them and decided that a revolver would have to be enough. The visible presence of these repeating rifles around Dodge City, in official hands and in private scabbards, reinforced a broader understanding. Power in a disputed street or crowded saloon no longer depended only on who drew a pistol fastest. It depended on who controlled access to the long guns and how many cartridges those rifles could fire before needing fresh ammunition. Law officers used municipal rules and the threat of organized rifle fire to assert that control within the deadline. Gangs and hard cases tried at times to challenge that balance, but most discovered that 2 or 3 men with Winchesters standing firm at key corners could make a whole trail crew think twice. That reality, formed in cowtown winters and hot cattle seasons, molded the expectations of lawmen who would soon carry similar rifles into other frontier towns and mining camps where the struggle between order and violence shifted next. May 5th, 1875. Mist rose from the Arkansas River as a flat ferry drifted toward the far bank below Fort Smith, its deck loaded with horses, riders, and a wagon carrying rolled bedding and sacks of feed. Deputy United States Marshal Bass Reeves sat his tall gray gelding near the bow, hat brim pulled low against the damp air. In the leather flap holster on his right hip rested a heavy Colt revolver. Across his saddle, tied down in a scabbard within easy reach, lay a Winchester lever-action rifle chambered for a center fire cartridge that matched the rounds in one of his sidearms. Inside his coat pocket, folded around a small Bible, were several paper warrants bearing the seal of the federal court that sat in the red brick building above the bluff. Each document named a man wanted for murder, robbery, or assault somewhere in the tangled jurisdictions of Indian Territory. Reeves had taken his oath as a deputy only weeks earlier, but he already knew the country ahead in detail. Years spent as a guide, scout, and farmer west of the Arkansas had taught him the locations of creek crossings, line cabins, tribal agency buildings, and the scattered settlements where fugitives might hide among relatives or friends. He spoke the languages of several tribes well enough to follow conversation and to make himself understood in camp. Now, wearing a badge under his coat, he moved from familiar ground into service that demanded regular trips of several hundred miles at a stretch. The court of Judge Isaac Parker expected its deputies to bring accused men back alive whenever possible. The same court did not forgive deputies who failed to do their duty. On the ferry, other men watched the tall deputy and his equipment. One, a white posseman hired for the trip, carried a single-shot carbine that had been issued to volunteers during the war. Another, a Cherokee tracker, kept a double-barrel shotgun across his lap and a small pouch of extra shells at his feet. They had both seen lever-action rifles before in the hands of hunters and drovers, but they were less certain about relying on them for marshal's work. The posseman had mentioned that more than once on the road from Fort Smith down to the ferry, saying that a good shotgun or a solid single-shot rifle would do all the killing that needed doing. Reeves listened and said little in reply. He trusted the weight of his chosen rifle more than the opinions of men who had not used one in a close fight. The warrants in his pocket named a family group, 3 brothers accused of killing a storekeeper during a robbery south of the Canadian River. Witnesses said that the men had ridden together into the settlement, drunk and armed, and had left after shots and shouting. The dead man lay behind his counter with a bullet through his chest. The brothers had not returned to their small farm near a tributary of the North Fork. Instead, they had been seen in the timber along a branch of the Deep Fork River, staying with cousins and passing word that they would not go back to Fort Smith to stand trial. Reeves had read their names in the marshal's office, memorized each, and asked questions about their habits. He knew which one was quickest with a pistol, which one tended to boast in saloons, and which one kept quiet but usually made the final decisions. Once the ferry touched the western shore, Reeves led his small party up the muddy slope and onto the wagon road. The 2 men with him rode slightly behind, their mounts picking careful steps among ruts and stones. They would travel together for several days before approaching the settlement where the brothers were reported to be hiding. Along the way, Reeves stopped at an agency building to ask about recent visitors, spoke with a trader running a small store at a river crossing, and paid attention to every comment that touched on men moving in groups, horses stolen or borrowed, and camps that had appeared unexpectedly along creeks. Each piece of information helped him narrow the ground he would have to cover once he left the main road. At a low ridge covered in blackjack oak, the deputy called a halt. While the horses rested, Reeves took his Winchester from the scabbard and checked it carefully. He opened the loading gate on the right side of the receiver and thumbed cartridges into the magazine tube until it felt full under his hand. He lowered the hammer to a safe position and worked the lever once, bringing a round into the chamber. The rifle now held a full magazine and a live cartridge ready under the hammer. He adjusted the rear sight to match the kind of ranges he expected in timber, not in open prairie. His hands moved with the practice of a man who had learned long ago that any firearm meant to back a badge needed to be prepared before there was trouble, not during it. The posseman watched this with something between curiosity and doubt. He asked why the deputy preferred a repeating rifle over a heavier single shot with more reach. Reeves answered in simple terms. The men they were riding to meet might be 3 in number or more once cousins and neighbors took sides. They might stand in a yard or run for the tree line. He wanted a rifle that would let him fire several aimed shots in quick succession without taking his eyes off the targets to reload. A single shot might put one man on the ground at a distance, but a lever action could decide the whole fight in the time it took others to understand that the first bullet had landed. He spoke without raising his voice, stating fact rather than argument. By late afternoon of the second day after leaving the ferry, the small party reached a settlement of a few scattered cabins near a brush-lined creek. Smoke rose from one chimney. Children played near a corral where 2 thin horses stood tied. Reeves and his men rode in slowly, giving everyone time to see them. He asked in plain terms whether anyone had seen the brothers in question. An older woman at the door of the nearest cabin hesitated, then nodded toward a track leading into heavier timber beyond the fields. The deputy thanked her, tipped his hat, and rode on. Once out of sight of the cabins, he halted again and changed his approach. Reeves preferred to take wanted men into custody without a public gunfight whenever he could. He had learned over the years that disguise and patient movement could save lives and keep bullets from hitting bystanders who had nothing to do with the crimes. For this trip, he carried an extra set of clothing rolled behind his saddle. In a stand of scrub oak, he dismounted and pulled on a worn overcoat and an old hat that changed his outline. He left his badge pinned inside his shirt and shifted the Winchester to lie across his saddle under a blanket. To a casual eye, he now looked like a field hand or a small farmer traveling alone. The posse man and the Cherokee tracker peeled off on a separate route to circle the suspected camp from another direction. The narrow track wound among trees and crossed small, dry washes. Reeves rode at a steady walk, eyes taking in every stump, bush, and turn in the path. He noted spots where a man could step off the trail and still see anyone coming. He counted the number of fresh hoofprints on the ground, matching them to what the woman in the cabin had suggested. After about a mile, he saw a thin column of smoke straight ahead. He stopped just long enough to slide his Winchester forward under the blanket so that he could draw it quickly if needed. Then he touched his heels lightly to the gelding's sides and moved on. The camp came into view in a clearing not much larger than a barn lot. A rough cabin stood near the center with a lean-to on one side and a stack of cut wood near the door. 3 horses were tied in the shade of a few trees at the edge of the clearing. 2 men sat on stumps near a fire, tin cups in their hands. A third worked at a saddle on the ground, back turned. Reeves counted the men and marked where each had left his rifle or pistol. One long gun leaned against the cabin wall. Another rested on a log near the fire. A revolver lay on a blanket close to the saddle. He rode into the clearing at an easy pace, giving a greeting as though he were a traveler asking for water. The men looked up, eyes narrowing as they saw a stranger. One reached slowly toward the long gun near the fire. Reeves swung down from his saddle, letting the reins fall so that the gray horse would stand. As he stepped away from the animal, his hand slid under the blanket and came out with the Winchester. He brought it to his shoulder in one smooth motion, the barrel covering the man closest to the rifle near the fire, then shifting slightly to keep all 3 within its arc. He spoke in a level voice, calling each brother by name and telling them that he held warrants for their arrest from the court at Fort Smith. The sudden appearance of the badge would have been one shock. The sight of a repeating rifle already lined on them at close range added another. One of the brothers, the talkative one Reeves had heard about, started to protest, saying that there were 3 of them and only one of him. The deputy answered that they might kill him, but that he would drop at least one of them before they could get to their rifles, and that his partners were in the woods with guns of their own, trained on the clearing. For a moment, tension hung between action and surrender. A hand hovered above the revolver on the blanket. Another man eased his weight toward the cabin wall where the other long gun rested. Reeves tightened his finger slightly on the Winchester's trigger and said that the first man to move for a weapon would be the first to die. The brothers knew the kind of damage a center fire rifle could do at that distance. They had seen deer knocked flat and horses crippled by such fire. One of them let out a breath and stepped back from the blanket. Another raised his hand slowly, keeping his eyes on the muzzle pointed at his chest. The Cherokee tracker stepped from the trees at the edge of the clearing, shotgun held at a low, ready position. The posseman emerged from the other side, his carbine in hand. With the circle complete, Reeves moved closer, keeping the Winchester steady. He ordered each man to turn and place his hands on the cabin wall. His partners took pistols from belts and long guns from where they rested. Once weapons were out of reach, Reeves slung the rifle and produced handcuffs and ropes. He read each man the charges against him using the language of the warrants and then bound their hands. The arrest had taken less than a minute from the time he first showed the rifle, and not a single shot had been fired. On the long ride back toward Fort Smith, the prisoners rode tied to their saddles, hands secured, feet under watch. Reeves and his men kept the captured weapons unloaded and strapped to a pack saddle. Whenever they approached a settlement or camp, the deputy made sure his Winchester was visible, resting across his thighs or in the crook of his arm. He wanted anyone thinking about an escape attempt or an ambush to see that one of the lawmen carried a rifle that could put more than one bullet into motion before an outlaw could recover from surprise. At night, while the men slept in turns, the lever action lay within arm's reach of whoever stood guard, magazine loaded and hammer lowered to a safe position, ready to answer any move by friends of the arrested brothers. In the weeks that followed, the story of the arrest spread quietly through the territory. Men who had known the brothers heard how a deputy had ridden into their camp alone and taken them without giving them a clear chance to draw. Some dismissed the tale as boasting. Others knew enough about Bass Reeves's patience and skill to believe that it had happened as described. Word also followed that he carried a repeating rifle and knew how to use it in ways that left little room for guesswork. Those who had thought of marshals as men with pistols and old carbines began to picture one particular deputy with a badge and a lever action. Within the marshal's office at Fort Smith, the episode added to a growing understanding. Deputies who rode into Indian territory for weeks at a time needed weapons that could keep several armed men under control at short distances in cabins, farmyards, or creek bottoms. A shotgun had its place at close range, and a single-shot rifle had value for long shots across open ground. But the combination of a strong repeating rifle and a revolver in matching caliber gave a single lawman the ability to dominate a small group once he had the drop on them. Bass Reeves's work in 1875 showed how that balance of firepower, matched with careful planning and knowledge of the land, could turn one deputy and a pair of assistants into a force that outlaws took seriously across a wide, unsettled territory. July 29th, 1884. Heat settled over the hills of Edwards County as the sun climbed, bleaching the grass around Green Lake until it took on a pale, dusty color. The shallow waterhole fed by springs along the South Llano drainage still held enough water to draw cattle and horses from miles around during a dry year. On its banks stood the Greer ranch buildings, low and solid, with sheep pens nearby and a line of barbed wire running along the edge of the lake to keep wandering stock from breaking through. That wire had become the center of a dispute that reached far beyond one ranch, part of a wider struggle between men who wanted to graze herds on open range and others who had begun to fence land, sink wells, and run sheep behind tight enclosures. By that summer, fence cutting had moved from scattered acts to organized campaigns across many Texas counties. Rough bands of riders, some calling themselves by names like the Owls or the Blue Devils, rode at night with pliers and file-sharpened nippers in their saddlebags. They cut long stretches of barbed wire, dropping fence lines so that cattle could drift through to water or grass on the other side. In dry districts that had once been common pasture, men without large holdings resented those who strung wire around big tracks and shut off access to traditional crossings. On the other side, ranchers who had spent scarce cash on posts and wire watched their investment torn down in hours. Tempers rose with every report of broken fences and cattle scattered into neighboring herds. The state government had already responded. In January of 1884, Governor John Ireland had called a special session of the legislature to deal with the damage and rising violence. New laws made fence-cutting and pasture-burning felony offenses punishable by prison terms. Property owners who fenced public land or blocked established roads also faced penalties and were ordered to remove illegal barriers and provide gates. Those measures did not end the conflict, but they gave local sheriffs, county attorneys, and the Texas Rangers a stronger legal basis for action. When complaints about fence cutting around Green Lake reached Austin through letters and telegrams, the Adjutant General's office turned to Company D of the Frontier Battalion and its captain, Lewis P. Seeker. Corporal Philip Cuney Baird, a stocky ranger with several years of service behind him, received orders to take a small detachment to the Greer place and investigate. With him rode 3 privates, O.D. Baker, W.W. Baker, and W.A. Mitchell. They carried Winchester repeating rifles and revolvers along with bedrolls, cooking gear, and 10 days of supplies. Each rifle fed from a tubular magazine and took center-fire cartridges suitable for work against men or heavy animals. The Rangers knew from experience that they could not count on help from nearby officers in isolated districts like this. Their safety would rest on the horses under them and on the reliability of the rifles they carried. When Baird's men reached the Greer ranch, they listened while ranchers described recent trouble. A cattle outfit led by Mark Hemphill and other associates had tried to force stock through the fence to water at the lake. One of the fence cutters had leveled a pistol at a Greer hand and threatened to kill him if he did not step away. The ranchers had backed off to avoid bloodshed, but they had promptly telegraphed for ranger assistance. Now, with Baird and his 3 men on the ground, the Greers hoped that the sight of state authority and the presence of repeating rifles would bring the matter under control before another confrontation turned deadly. Baird decided to watch before acting. He positioned his detachment in concealment near a section of fence and stone wall where he believed the cutters would return. The Rangers spread out along brush and low rises within sight of the lake, close enough to see horses and riders, but far enough back to avoid easy detection. Heat pressed down on them as the day advanced. The air above the short mesquite and scattered live oaks flickered in waves. Sweat soaked their shirts under brown canvas jackets. They lay still with rifles within reach, watching dust on the horizon for any sign of movement. Toward afternoon, riders appeared. Hemphill and companions came up with a group of horses and headed straight for the fence line. Words had already passed between them and the Greers earlier in the day. Hemphill had sent a note demanding that a gap be left in the wire so that his animals could drink. The ranchers had refused, stating that they did not want trouble but would not cut their own fence. Now Hemphill came to make good on his threat. His party dismounted near the junction of an old rock fence and the new barbed wire. While one man held the horses, others went to work on the wire, cutting strands and opening an opening large enough for stock to pass. From their concealed positions, the Rangers watched the men move and listened to the sound of wire snapping. Baird held his squad in place. He wanted to catch the cutters in clear violation of the law, with evidence in hand, but he did not want to start a gunfight while horses and unarmed ranch hands were mingled around the lakeshore. Once the gap in the fence stood wide, Hemphill and his associates drove a group of horses through to the water. The animals crowded along the bank, heads down, sucking at the remaining pools. The cutters stayed hidden below the bank, out of sight from most angles, but Baird could see enough from his vantage point to be certain of what they had done. When the stock had drunk, Hemphill's party withdrew. The Greers and their hands moved in after them to repair the damage. Wire went back on posts. The rock fence, already old when the barbed wire had been added, was checked for loose stones. Then, for a time, quiet returned. Baird and his men remained, hidden, waiting for the next move. In mid-afternoon, a local man named John Brunson rode up to the ranch house with a new note from Hemphill. The message was short and direct. If the Greers did not leave a gap in the fence, Hemphill said he would open one himself. The answer went back with equal clarity, telling him that the ranchers wished no quarrel but would not tolerate another cut. The next chapter in the dispute unfolded just as the Rangers had expected. Hemphill and his partner, using the warning as their own justification, came back to Green Lake. With them was a younger rider, Henry Burton, who helped handle the horses. Once again, they rode to the join between stone fence and wire, this time with a clearer intention not only to water animals but to challenge the fence openly. From their new positions around the lake, Baird's men watched the small party dismount and lead horses out of sight below the bank. The cutters carried rifles, at least one of them another Winchester, and pistols at their belts. Baird judged that the moment for intervention had arrived. He split his squad. He moved along the north side of the lake to a point that gave him a clear view of the rock fence and the slope beyond. He sent O.D. Baker, W.W. Baker, and Mitchell along the south side with orders to get into position where they could block any attempt by the cutters to escape along that route or to use the stone wall as a shield. The Rangers kept low as they shifted, staying behind brush and rises. Dust rose from their boots as they ran, but they were close enough now that speed mattered more than hiding tracks. When the cutters finished with the wire and began to bring the horses up, the Rangers moved. The men below the bank caught sight of them and scrambled for cover behind the rock fence. Baird stepped into open view at a distance of about 150 yards and called for surrender. His voice carried clearly across the water and through the still air. He told the men behind the wall that they were under arrest for fence cutting and that they should come out with their hands up. The response came back as shouted curses. Rifles appeared over the rock line, muzzles pointed toward the advancing Rangers. Baird repeated his order several times. According to accounts written later, he gave the cutters at least 4 chances to lay down their arms. On the last, Hemphill shouted an insult and raised his rifle. The first shot of the engagement came from behind the stone wall. Bullets snapped through the air around the Rangers, kicking dust and chips from rocks. Instantly, Baird and his men answered. Winchesters on both sides began to fire, levers working as men shot from whatever cover they could find. The steady metallic click and thud of the actions matched the sharper cracks of the rounds. On the south side, as they tried to flank the rock wall, the 2 Bakers and Mitchell came under heavy fire. W.W. Baker took a bullet in the left side, the impact, dropping him near a live oak. Blood soaked his shirt and ran down into the dry grass. He dragged himself behind the tree and tried to keep his rifle in operation, but the wound weakened him quickly. O.D. Baker and Mitchell continued forward in short bursts, using what little cover the broken ground and scattered stone offered. Fire from the fence cutters kept their heads low. For a moment it looked as if the small Ranger detachment might be forced back from the wall by opponents who held a better position. Then a complication nearly turned the fight. In the rush to move, O.D. Baker had loaded his Winchester with cartridges of the wrong caliber, rounds that would not feed smoothly through the action. When he tried to cycle the lever, the gun balked. Under fire, he had to spring behind a tree, open the loading gate, and work the mismatched cartridges out of the magazine one by one. His hands moved quickly, flicking the brass out onto the ground. Once the rifle was clear, he reached for the correct ammunition and began to refill the magazine, knowing that any delay increased the chance that a bullet from the rock wall would find him. Mitchell managed to gain a position behind part of the stone fence that bent at an angle away from the cutter's main line. From there, he could lean out and fire along the face where the fence cutters crouched behind mesquite and rock. Each time he saw a hat crown or a shoulder appear, he snapped off a shot and worked the lever. Across the lake, Baird advanced on foot, using scrub and dips in the earth to shield himself as he tried to bring his rifle to bear on the same targets. Shots from the cutters struck near him, throwing up splinters of stone. The fight settled into a brutal exchange, each man firing when he judged he had a clear target and using the repeating action of his weapon to send more than one bullet into every opportunity. At a critical moment, one of the cutters, identified later under the alias John Mason, stepped from behind his cover to take aim at Mitchell. His body rose into full view above the wall, rifle coming up. By then, O.D. Baker had his Winchester cleared and loaded with proper rounds. He fired, hitting Mason in the chest. Mitchell, seeing the same threat, sent another bullet into the same man's upper body. Mason staggered and tried to retreat behind the mesquite. As he moved, he exposed his head and shoulders to the line of fire from the north side of the lake. Baird, watching for just such an opening, fired again. The shot struck the fence cutter in the head, dropping him for good behind the low bushes. The other men behind the wall saw Mason go down and felt the fire from both flanks growing more accurate. They decided not to stand. Mounting quickly, they spurred their horses away from the lake, using the contour of the ground to escape the overlapping arcs of Ranger rifles. Baird and his unhurt men fired several more rounds, but their priority shifted at once to reaching W.W. Baker, who lay badly wounded near the tree. They broke off pursuit, crossed the ground where bullets still fell from a few belated shots, and gathered around their injured comrade. The Greer family, who had watched much of the fight from nearby, came to help. They carried Baker to the ranch house and did what they could to staunch the bleeding. Water in buckets and makeshift cans cooled by damp cloths was used to wash and soothe the wound in the heat of the evening. While the ranchers tended him, Baird circled back to the body of the dead fence cutter. As he approached, he spotted one of the fleeing men, later identified as Brunson, trying to return under fire to collect Mason's weapons and ammunition. Baird and others fired at his feet, throwing up dust and forcing him to break off and run. Brunson mounted and galloped away, deciding that the risk of staying was too high. From Mason's body, the Rangers recovered a Winchester rifle, a pistol, and a cartridge belt. Those items went into their own depleted stock. During the fight, they had expended a significant number of rounds from their magazines, each shot taken under pressure from a fortified enemy. Estimates by Greer and others later suggested that roughly 150 shots had been traded around the lake, a level of fire consistent with a short, sharp clash between men on both sides armed with repeaters. The combination of several Rangers, each able to fire quickly, had offset the disadvantage of a smaller squad facing opponents behind a solid stone line. As darkness approached, Baird organized the defense of the ranch in case the cutters returned with reinforcements. The Greers worried that friends and relatives of the dead man would come back in numbers to seek revenge. Rangers and ranch hands built a rough barricade from cedar posts and available materials, placing firing positions with clear views toward the likely approaches. Through the night, someone remained on guard while others tried to sleep. Baker lay on a bed inside with a bucket rigged above his wound to drip cool water and keep down inflammation. By morning, a rider had reached Junction City and brought back a doctor who cleaned and dressed the injury, giving the wounded Ranger a good chance of survival. In the days that followed, official reports and private letters carried news of the Green Lake fight to Austin and beyond. Baird sent a telegram describing the clash, noting that one fence cutter had been killed and one Ranger seriously hurt. Captain Seeker forwarded that message with his own comments to the Adjutant General, who in turn kept the governor informed. Local officers arrested Brunson and others on charges related to fence cutting and assault. At the same time, friends of the dead man tried to stir opposition to the Rangers, claiming that state officers had overstepped their authority. Complaints reached political allies and newspapers urging investigations and prosecutions of the men who had fired on fence cutters at the lake. Ranchers in the area took the opposite view. Many of them saw the engagement as overdue protection after months of threats and property damage. The Greer brothers, fearing that they would be targets for retaliation, wrote to Austin asking to be placed on the Ranger rolls without pay so that they could carry handguns legally and act in support of the company when needed. Lieutenant Frank Jones later visited the district, talked with neighbors, and recommended that the request be granted. Describing the brothers as reliable men who understood the country and could aid enforcement. Their letters make clear how vulnerable isolated landowners felt when the nearest sheriff might be 40 miles away and fence cutters could ride up at any time with Winchesters of their own. For the Texas Rangers, Green Lake became one illustration of their role in the fence-cutting conflict. A handful of state officers with repeating rifles had confronted a determined group of armed men, absorbed a serious wound in the process, and still enforced the state's new law at a remote waterhole. The fight showed how barbed wire, drought, and the spread of powerful rifles combined to turn earlier disagreements over grazing into concentrated bursts of gunfire. It also confirmed that in such confrontations, the side that could bring disciplined, coordinated fire from lever-action rifles to bear at the right moment would usually dominate, even when numbers were close and both groups were familiar with the same weapons. The lessons from that July day on the South Llano joined other experiences in shaping how Rangers and local law officers used repeating rifles to impose state authority during the last years of the open range. October 5, 1892. Fog hung low over the railroad tracks at Coffeyville, Kansas, when the 5 riders came in from the west along the sleepy edge of town. Their coats were pulled close, hats set down to shade their faces. They followed the tracks until they could turn toward the shallow alley that ran behind the brick buildings near the plaza. The horses breathed steam into the cool air, hooves clicking on scattered stones. When they reached a sheltered spot behind the Condon Bank, the men swung down and tied their mounts to a rail near sheds, as if they meant only to make a short visit. Under their long coats, each carried a Winchester rifle, the barrels held close along their legs to keep the steel out of sight. The leader, Bob Dalton, had chosen the day and the town with care. He had once served as a deputy in these parts and knew the faces of shopkeepers, clerks, and officers who lived around Walnut Street. He also knew the shape of the banks that anchored Coffeyville's business district, C.M. Condon and Company on one corner and the First National Bank across the way on Union Street. His plan was simple on paper and grand in its ambition. He wanted both institutions robbed at the same moment in clear daylight, a feat that, in his own words, would outdo the record of earlier bandits who had stolen from one place at a time. If they could seize money and gold from both vaults and break out before anyone organized a response, the gang expected to leave Kansas behind with enough cash to start new lives elsewhere. They carried weapons meant to give them that advantage. Each man had a revolver on his hip and a Winchester rifle under his coat. The lever-action rifles gave them the ability to throw a long line of bullets down a street or through a doorway without stopping to reload after every shot. They knew that town marshals and most citizens who might try to interfere would be armed only with revolvers or older single-shot rifles kept in back rooms. The gang had used such repeaters on earlier jobs, pulling them quickly from scabbards when they needed to control train crews or frightened bystanders. The memory of those successes fed their confidence as they checked cinches and gave last instructions beside the alley that morning. Yet Coffeyville in 1892 was not the same place Bob remembered from his earlier service. New false front buildings rose along the plaza, sidewalks made of wood and in some stretches of brick-connected banks, dry goods stores, and hardware shops. On that morning, workers were busy at street improvements, setting new paving and digging trenches. One of those men, shovel in hand, looked up from his work when he saw the 5 figures emerge from the alley in a tight knot, hats low, faces set, long coats hanging straight despite the mild weather. He noticed the way they moved together, dog trotting across open space rather than strolling, and he caught a glimpse of gun stocks under the cloth. The worker recognized some of those faces, at least enough to feed his suspicion. With a sharp breath, he dropped his shovel and shouted that the Daltons were in town and that they were going for the bank. His voice bounced off the brick facades. A store clerk at a nearby doorway heard him and ran inside, calling for his employer. A man in front of a drugstore turned and stared, watching the group split as planned, Bob and Emmett angling toward the First National, while Grat Dalton, Dick Broadwell, and Bill Powers turned toward the Condon Bank. The sudden alarm spread along the block as quickly as a spilled lamp flame. Inside the Condon Bank, the day had begun as usual. Clerks counted deposits, checked ledgers, and processed notes. The light from the front windows fell across polished counters and iron bars. When Grat and his two partners came through the door with rifles coming free of their coats, the calm broke at once. Grat leveled his Winchester at the cashier and ordered everyone to stand back and keep their hands where he could see them. Powers and Broadwell took positions near the entrance, rifles ready to cover the street. The manager was driven at gunpoint toward the vault, where the heavy safe door stood open for routine business. Grat thrust a grain sack toward the cashier and ordered him to fill it with currency. When he saw bags of silver stacked on the floor, he had them dragged into the sack as well, building a load that would soon weigh more than a man could easily carry. Across the way at the First National, Bob and Emmett followed a similar pattern. They pushed through the front door with Winchesters raised and shouted for everyone to stand away from the counters. Customers froze. The cashier, Thomas Ayres, stood rooted behind his station. Bob ordered him to move quickly to the safe and open it. While Emmett kept the room covered, Bob drove Ayres to the rear, forcing him to release cash and coin from the inner compartments. Notes went into another sack, along with smaller quantities of gold. When a customer tried to slip toward the door, Emmett swung his rifle toward the movement and snapped an order to stay put. Outside, the town was no longer quiet. As word of the robbery spread, men abandoned their ordinary work and ran toward the plaza. Some took to the alleys, hoping to get closer without being seen. Others rushed straight along the sidewalks, boots ringing on the boards. Their first thought was not flight, but resistance. This was their town, their banks, their deposits in the vaults. The instinct of the place was to fight back. What turned that instinct into effective action was not only courage, but the presence of two hardware stores stocked with firearms and ammunition only a short distance from the scene. In one of those stores, a clerk rushed to the display racks as customers shouted that the bank was being robbed. He pulled Winchester rifles from pegs, worked the levers to make sure they were clear, and passed them to any man who could be trusted to shoot. Another handed out boxes of cartridges, helping shaking fingers push brass rounds into magazines. In the span of a few minutes, a scattering of unarmed citizens became a loose company of riflemen, each suddenly holding the same kind of repeater that the outlaws carried. Men stepped into doorways, took positions in upstairs windows, and settled behind barrels and boxes with their backs pressed to the walls. The street work crew joined them, some with borrowed rifles, others with pistols they had left in coat pockets earlier that morning. Inside the First National, Bob and Emmett attempted to move the next stage of their plan into motion. With sacks of money in hand, they herded Ayres and other bank officers toward the front door to use them as walking shields. When they stepped back into the street, the first bullets from town defenders were already in the air. An express company agent who had armed himself with a revolver fired from close range. The shot screamed past the outlaws and shattered glass. Bob and Emmett jerked their captives aside and fired back with their Winchesters, the recoil driving against their shoulders as they worked the levers. The exchange forced them to abandon the human shields on the sidewalk and withdraw through a rear exit, dragging their sacks and looking for a path toward the alley where the horses waited. At the Condon Bank, the sound of gunfire carried through the windows. Great Dalton, listening from inside the vault area, realized that the town had armed itself far more quickly than he had expected. The sack he had ordered filled with silver now felt unwieldy, every step dragging. He made a rapid calculation. Rather than try to haul the full load, he dumped much of the heavy coin back onto the vault floor and stuffed paper notes into his coat pockets. His partners shifted, trying to cover both the front and back of the building. Shots from outside began smashing through the glass, sending splinters across the floor and cutting pale streaks in the plaster. Civilians in nearby buildings were firing from cover, aiming at shapes behind the counters. On the street side of the bank, one of the hardware store owners, Henry Isham, and his clerk, Charles Cluer, took up firing positions. Isham, aware of how much damage a poorly aimed shot could do in a crowded town center, used his front door reluctantly. He let other men fire from windows while he stepped back to manage the flow of rifles and cartridges. Cluer knelt where he could see the entrance to the Condon Bank through a gap in a nearby structure. His Winchester rested along the sill, barrel steady, magazine loaded. Each time a figure moved in the doorway or at the broken windows, he took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. Inside, the outlaws felt the shots crush into wood and metal around them. Along the rear alley, Bob and Emmett fought their way toward the horses. A young man named Lucius Baldwin, who had taken up a watch near the back of the First National, confronted them with his own pistol in hand. Bob shouted for him to drop the gun and step aside. Baldwin hesitated, and in that instant, Bob fired. The Winchester bullet struck the young man and dropped him in the dirt. The outlaws crashed past his body, breath coming raggedly, rifles slick with sweat where their hands gripped the stocks. On 8th Street, near the intersection with Walnut, two townsmen, George Cubine and Charles Brown, stood with a Winchester between them, waiting for a clear target. When Bob and Emmett broke into view, Cubine raised the rifle to fire. Bob swung his own weapon first, shooting Cubine in the head. Brown bent to grab the fallen man's rifle, but before he could bring it fully to his shoulder, another shot from the outlaw's Winchester hit him. Both fell within a few feet of each other, their bodies forming a wrenching reminder of the cost the town would pay for resistance. Back inside the Condon Bank, the fight reached its peak. Townsmen firing from the hardware store and nearby buildings had broken most of the windows. Grat and his companions answered with bursts from their own Winchesters whenever they saw movement, but the angles favored the defenders. Cluer, watching the vault entrance, saw a chance when Great stepped into a clearer line of sight. He fired and struck the outlaw in the throat. Great reeled back, blood flowing down his shirt, and stumbled toward the rear. The remaining robbers tried to pull him along and still hold off the guns outside. The town marshal, Charles Connolly, hearing the continuous crack of rifles, ran from the direction of the jail with a weapon in his hands. He cut through alleys, trying to reach a position where he could aid the defenders, but he misjudged the line of fire around the Condon Bank. As he crossed a side street, Powers saw movement and shot him. Connolly fell within sight of men he had served beside for years, another casualty of a battle that had turned the heart of Coffeyville into a cramped, lethal maze. In the rear alley, the surviving outlaws tried to regroup. Bullets continued to whip through the air from multiple directions. A townsman fired from behind the shelter of a coal shed. Another shot came from an upstairs window. The gang realized they could not linger. Broadwell, wounded but still mobile, staggered toward his horse. Powers attempted to mount, swinging one leg over the saddle while holding his Winchester one-handed. Before he could settle, rifle fire from the hardware store and other positions caught him. He fell into the alley, his body slipping from the horse and crumpling in the dust. Bob, now hit by at least one bullet, tried to reach his mount. Another round from a defender tore into him, and he collapsed near the hitching rail. Emmett, still on his feet and not yet aware of all his wounds, managed to swing into the saddle. Seeing his brother down, he tried to haul Bob's body across the horse in front of him. As he leaned, a shotgun blast from a citizen's position slammed into his back and hips, filling him with buckshot. He and his brother tumbled together. The horse bolted, reins flying loose. Broadwell, badly hurt, did manage to ride out of town, but he was found later along the road, dead from his wounds. Within minutes, the heavy firing faded. The square around the banks was streaked with broken glass and pitted by bullets. Smoke drifted through the air in slow curtains. Most of the gang lay dead where they had fallen. Bob and Grat Dalton, Bill Powers, and Dick Broadwell were all down, their Winchesters still near their hands or tangled in their coats. Emmett lay among them, riddled with more than 20 wounds, yet breathing. Nearby, the bodies of Cubine, Brown, Connolly, and Baldwin marked the spots where citizens and officers had stood to face the robbers. Other townspeople and bank employees staggered away, nursing wounds, some from bullets, some from flying glass and splinters. Once the outlaws were confirmed down, the citizens who had fought them shifted from fury to sober work. Rifles were cleared and set aside. Men went carefully through the pockets of the dead to identify them and to recover stolen money. Bank officers checked the vaults and safes. Much of the cash and gold had not left the buildings at all, and more was found in sacks dropped as the gang tried to fight and carry their plunder at the same time. Emmett was taken into custody and given medical attention enough to keep him alive long enough to face court. He would later stand trial, receive a life sentence, and spend years in prison thinking back on the morning when repeating rifles in many hands had shattered the plan that he and his brothers had thought so bold. News of the Coffeyville fight traveled quickly out of Kansas by telegraph and newspaper columns. Editors labeled the place the town that stopped the Daltons and described how ordinary citizens had armed themselves from local hardware stores and engaged the gang with a volume of fire equal to that of the bandits. The story underlined a new reality. By the 1890s, repeating rifles were no longer the special tools of a few lawmen or outlaws. They were available behind the counters of shops in almost every settled town. When a group of criminals tried to use them to overwhelm a community in broad daylight, the same class of weapon in the hands of clerks, merchants, and officers turned the narrow streets into a killing ground where the attackers had no safe path. For sheriffs, marshals, and detectives across the region, the lesson of Coffeyville was clear. Outlaws armed with Winchesters and similar repeaters could deliver sudden, intense fire, but they could not expect to dominate any place where disciplined riflemen could form quickly from the local population. For lawmen who already carried such rifles in scabbards or office racks, the Coffeyville fight confirmed the importance of keeping those arms ready and ensuring that trusted citizens knew how to handle them when the need arose. The double bank raid that was meant to prove the power of a small, heavily armed gang instead showed how repeating rifles in many responsible hands could turn a whole town into something close to a one-man army at every corner, defeating an outlaw band that had counted too much on fear and surprise. August 24th, 1896. Night still held the fields near Lawson in Oklahoma Territory when the posse under Deputy United States Marshal Heck Thomas settled into position around the small farmhouse. The air was thick from a recent shower, damp soil holding the smell of grass and dust. Crickets sounded along the fence lines. A few lamps burned faintly in distant homes, but around the targeted place the lawmen kept to the dark. They had tied their horses well back among cottonwoods and moved forward on foot, carrying Winchester repeating rifles and sturdy shotguns. Every man knew the name of the outlaw they expected to meet there before dawn. William "Bill" Doolin, a leader of the Wild Bunch whose robberies and gunfights had pulled law officers across Indian and Oklahoma territories for years. Doolin had already slipped the law once that summer. Captured earlier by Thomas and other marshals and lodged in the jail at Guthrie, he had broken out with help and disappeared into the country he knew well. Reports put him in various places around the Cimarron and the Canadian, staying with friends and relatives. One steady line of information pointed to the area around Lawson, where his wife and child stayed at the home of her parents. Thomas, who had spent years tracking the movements of outlaw gangs, believed that even the most cautious fugitive would risk a visit to see his family. With that in mind, he had gathered a small group of deputies and trusted possemen, armed with repeaters and shotguns, and ridden quietly to the area. They did not approach the house openly. Instead, Thomas placed his men in a rough circle. One deputy lay in a shallow depression near the back door, Winchester resting along the lip of dirt. Another took cover near a woodpile that offered a view of the front yard. A third crouched in a cluster of weeds close enough to cover the gate. Thomas himself chose a position where he could see the front door and still signal to his men if he needed them to hold or advance. Each rifle and shotgun was loaded. Cartridges lay in loops along belts ready to refill magazines if the fight lasted longer than a single burst. Inside the house, the occupants had ended the night with ordinary routines, unaware at first that a ring of armed men had formed in the darkness outside. Doolin had not yet arrived. He was expected from the direction of a nearby bathing resort, where he had been seen taking the waters to ease chronic pain in his legs and back. The posse had learned of that habit from local sources who had seen a large man with a limp moving carefully in and out of the springs over several days. The pattern gave Thomas a narrow window in which Doolin would almost certainly be walking or riding along a known path to reach his family. The marshal meant to use that predictability to end a long pursuit. Just before dawn, a single rider approached the house at a slow pace. The horse's hoofbeats sounded dull against the damp ground. The man in the saddle sat with a familiar stoop, broad shoulders bent slightly forward. As he drew closer, one of the deputies near the fence caught his outline against the faint light on the horizon and recognized the shape described by informants. The posse held fire. Thomas had instructed them that they were to challenge Doolin first and take him alive if possible. The law wanted him in court as a visible symbol that the days of powerful roaming gangs were closing. The repeaters and shotguns around the house were insurance in case the man refused. The rider dismounted a short distance from the door and led his horse toward a small shed. He moved with the stiffness of a man who had carried injuries for years, but he still handled the animal with practiced ease. Slung under his arm and in his scabbard were the tools that had earned him a reputation, a Winchester rifle and a revolver. He had used such weapons in train robberies, bank jobs, and running gunfights with posses, counting on their firepower and his nerve to break pursuers' will. That habit of going armed had kept him alive in earlier fights. On this morning, it ensured that the lawmen watching him would not treat him as a harmless visitor. When Doolin turned from the horse toward the porch, Thomas gave the signal. Several men rose from their cover at once, weapons aimed. Their voices joined in a harsh command that cut through the soft pre-dawn sounds, ordering the outlaw to stop and raise his hands. For an instant he froze. Then everything moved at once. Some accounts from the officers present later stated that Doolin tried to bring his rifle into line, hauling it up from where it hung under his arm. Others remembered him reaching toward his revolver. None of the lawmen thought he intended to surrender without a struggle. What followed lasted only a few seconds. As Doolin shifted, the deputies fired. Winchester rifles spoke in quick succession, the levers working almost automatically between shots. A shotgun roared, buckshot spreading at close range. Pellets and bullets struck Doolin before he could send more than one shot, if he managed to fire at all. He fell hard onto the packed earth of the yard, his weapons scattering from his hands. The echo of the firing rolled away across the fields and into the low hills. Inside the house, his wife and in-laws woke fully to the sound of gunfire and the shouting of men. Silence settled as the marshals advanced cautiously, barrels trained on the motionless figure in the yard. Thomas approached from the front, rifle still ready, and nudged one of the fallen weapons away with his boot. The outlaw's clothes were torn by multiple holes. Blood spread in dark patches across his chest and side. His face, which had been widely described on wanted posters, now lay slack. After checking for any sign of breath, the deputies confirmed that he was dead. Years of robberies, escapes, and narrow fights had ended in a brief exchange on a farmhouse lawn under fire from several repeating guns aimed by men who had prepared carefully to leave him no route out. With the immediate threat gone, the posse secured the scene. One deputy entered the house, identified himself to the family, and ordered everyone to stay back from the windows. Others gathered Doolin's Winchester and revolver, along with any cartridges he carried in belts or pockets. Those items would be taken back as evidence and as proof for officials and newspapers that the man killed at Lawson was indeed the leader of the gang that had raided trains and banks across the territories. A wagon was summoned from nearby, and the body was placed in it under a sheet for the journey into town. The ride back from Lawson turned into a public display. Along the road, settlers and townspeople who had heard rumors of the ambush stepped out to look. Some recognized the heavy frame under the covering and the outline of the boots. Others heard marshals say the name aloud. There was little cheering. Most people watched in an even, measuring way, knowing that a dangerous man was gone, but also aware that his death marked an end to a long period when outlaw bands had moved almost at will through the countryside. On arrival in a larger town, the sheet was pulled back long enough for photographs and formal identification. The image of Doolin's body propped against a board would later appear in prints that circulated widely. Within the marshal service, the killing at Lawson carried more weight than a single arrest or shootout. For years, Thomas, Bill Tillman, Chris Madsen, and other deputies had ridden after members of the Wild Bunch and similar gangs. They had faced men who knew the terrain, who had friends in many settlements, and who carried repeating rifles equal to their own. The lawmen responded by organizing more tightly, planning ambushes based on intelligence, and making sure that every posse sent against such targets carried enough firepower to finish a fight quickly once it began. The morning at Lawson stood as a clear example of that method. A carefully planned surround using multiple repeaters and shotguns to neutralize a single well-armed outlaw leader before he could bring his own guns fully into play. For ranchers, small farmers, and town merchants across Oklahoma and Indian Territory, the news that Doolin lay dead under the guns of Thomas's posse meant that one of the most active sources of train and bank robberies had been removed. They still faced theft, local crime, and occasional violence, but the days when a large mounted gang could ride in broad daylight into a settlement, fire Winchesters in the air, and expect to hold off poorly armed officers were slipping away. Telegraph lines now brought rapid messages to marshals' offices. Railroads could move deputies and their repeating rifles quickly toward trouble. Communities that had once been scattered clusters of cabins now formed towns with hardware stores and citizens, willing to pick up rifles to stand beside formal lawmen. The Lawson killing did not end all outlawry in the region. Smaller gangs and lone criminals remained. Yet the event marked a point after which no group of bandits matched the scale or reach of outfits like Doolin's Wild Bunch for that territory. The law had shown that it could track, surround, and destroy a leader regarded for years as nearly untouchable. The tools that made that possible included patience, informants, and hard riding, but also the steel and wood of the repeating rifles cradled in the hands of Thomas's men around the farmhouse. From that morning forward, the idea that an outlaw with a Winchester and a revolver could dominate wide stretches of the frontier, with little fear of organized resistance, rang less true in the territories where federal deputies and local officers now answered with equal arms and coordinated fire whenever such a challenge appeared.